Everyone knows that the American automotive industry is a shadow of what it used to be. But what if that's not true? Adam Ozimek is the chief economist at the Economic Innovation Group, and he's the author of a recent report about the state of the American automotive industry. And this report tries to tackle some of the myths about the decline of the American auto industry. And that's what the topic of today's show is about. How healthy is the auto industry in America? How is it impacted by labor unions, competition from Japan, and more? And what might Trump's tariffs do to it now? As always, thank you for listening to the New Liberal Podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, the best way to support us is by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that by going to cnliberalism.org/become a member. Get access to bonus episodes of the podcast, cool swag in your mailbox, access to our community Slack, and much more. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Adam Ozimek. Adam, welcome to the show.
Glad to be back again.
You have recently helped author a report about the automotive industry in the U.S., and this occupies a special place in kind of the American mythos, the American economy. When people have ideas about it, the automotive industry has kind of this large place in our national conception of ourselves. And everybody knows that the American car industry is struggling and it's dying, and the Japanese killed it in the 80s, and that it's just never going to come back. And that's what the report is about, right?
That's right. Trying to take those myths on, trying to look at the data, understand what is the actual state of this industry. What does the history tell us?
All right. So, yeah, I'm kind of being tongue-in-cheek here, obviously, when I say, American manufacturing is dead and automotive manufacturing is especially dead, and it's been dead for several decades now. But these are things that people believe. And before we get into all the data, because it's a really interesting report, but I'm curious if you kind of have an idea about why in particular is the automotive industry such a important thing in America, either just economically or it really more like the idea of the automotive industry? Because people have really strong feelings about this kind of stuff and about cars in particular. And, maybe it's a cultural thing about having memories of their Ford Mustang when they were growing up, or their Chevy Camaro is it's a cultural icon thing. Or maybe it's, I think about I don't know, it seems so important. The only industry that was really bailed out in 2008, 2009, other than the banks, was the automotive industry. People were really concerned that in particular would go under. So why is it that people have so much, it takes up such a space in our collective minds?
I think there are a variety of reasons that run the gamut from the emotional to the somewhat more rational. The big three were a major part of U.S. economic history. They were at one time globally dominant. They were front and center of the invention of mass assembly from Henry Ford. So these were important. They were important economically. The automobile is important socially, allowing movement, changing the way we live. We were a very auto-oriented culture before most other similar income countries. So the car is important here. Those companies are important here. And that's sort of an emotional story. But you can argue that, if you look at the experience of World War II, all the automakers played a major role in, in building out our defense industrial complex. And so there's this idea that if you have another mass conflict, You want to be able to make vehicles. You want that capacity to make vehicles domestically. I don't know how true that is, but it's not something I would dismiss out of hand. So I think it runs the gamut. And then, on the left, there's also quite a bit of mythologizing as well. The so-called Treaty of Detroit, where the UAW solidified their negotiations with the Big Three, is often held as like a high watermark for unionization in the United States. So the change of it, the beginning of a really important era of high unionization. Of course, missing how the central role that played in the decline of Detroit, but that's beside the point. So I think that, across the political spectrum, there are reasons that people romanticize the industry and give it that extra importance.
I think that makes sense. And, the cultural role of all this, I think, is really central in that cars are an idea of freedom. Traditionally, when a teenager got their first car, it's like you're really an adult now. You can go where you want to go and hit the open road. And, so much of our greatest works of art, our greatest films and TV shows and music is so tied into that idea. So I guess it's not that surprising. But there is this persistent idea that's been around for a long time that the US auto industry has collapsed, essentially, that it used to be this globe spanning behemoth, industrial might, and now it's gone and dead. And I guess my question is, we're obviously setting this up as a sort of that's not true. But I'll ask the question this way. Is it even partially true? Is there some truth to that? Or is it entirely, the auto industry is actually doing just fine?
Well, I think that the place where there's a problem is in some traditional hubs of auto production. It's not the case that the U.S. auto industry has declined. It is the case that Detroit's auto industry has declined and Michigan's auto industry has declined. So there is a place-specific problem. But the U.S. as a whole assembles about as many vehicles as we have. We made about 10.5 million 2024, and that's like close to the historical average. Ironically, the last time we had a really strong production boom was after NAFTA. We had, a few years of being above 12 million assemblies, and now we're down to around 10.5. So, but historically, we're close to average. And if you look at employment, we have about 1 million auto workers. Again, this is close to historical average going back decades. So, we still have the capacity that we had. And what's more, the capacity is in higher value production. So if you look at estimates of like industrial output or real value added, those are at historical highs. So we have the same amount of people working in autos. We have about the same amount of assemblies, but we're doing more high value added stuff. A lot of the smaller cars tend to get imported. The lower value added, the easier stuff gets built in Mexico. We do more of the higher value added assembly here.
I mean, isn't it though the whole idea that like we're still around the same thing that is surprising and I think important. But at the same time, the automotive industry worldwide has expanded greatly, and like where the US used to be number one, now it seems like pretty easily China is number one. And haven't we lost as a percentage of kind of the world market in that sense?
There's this really there's an attempt to try to look for all these like structural explanations for why some of our industries are have not grown more, right? And you see this with, for example, steel, right? But Noah Smith has this really great chart where he shows that like the biggest uh, most consistent explanation for low when steel output is low and steel output is high is how much steel the U.S. economy is using. And so the same is kind of true of U.S. auto consumption is not that much higher than it was historically in terms of like unit sales. And so yes, China is the leader. China is also a lot bigger than we are. And so and they're also growing faster. So they're adding more capacity faster. So I think that there's this sort of inevitability that comes from size and scale, and the fact that the U.S. is a uh, developed, slower growing country. We're just going to be using less steel, and we have, you know, less net new additions in household consumption and auto demand. There's still a lot of people in China going from no car to their first car, so you're just going to have more growth there.
Is it the case that it's just like, well, the US makes pretty high-end, pretty high-value cars for the US market and to some degree for foreign markets, but as China got rich, they got middle income exploded in China, the degree of middle class there, but their middle class still requires a pretty cheap car that American manufacturers just don't make. We don't make $10,000 cars brand new anymore. And that's kind of what the Chinese middle class needs. And so they have Chinese manufacturers to make that. Is that kind of the story of just everybody's kind of serving their own domestic market to some extent?
Everyone serving their own domestic market is very much the story of global auto production to a certain extent. Like, most cars tend to be made in the area where the cars are consumed. They're big, they're heavy, they're hard to ship, and that's just been the story for a long time. So there is that tendency for most cars to be made where they're consumed. In the case of China, there's a variety of things going on. You had for a long time the requirement that U.S. automakers form a joint venture. So if you want to sell to China, come make in China, and partner with a Chinese company. And so that was the story for a while. It's becoming increasingly the case that Chinese automakers seem to be at the sort of production frontier. They're making very, very good cars, and cars that probably would be competitive in the U.S. market. They're making, trucks, cars. They're not all on the super cheap end, but a lot of them are. So they've got something going on there innovation wise, that I think is slightly different and is going to make them a global competitor in the world market.
Now, there's something that you hinted at earlier when you said, look, US production of cars has been steady. And there's some great graphs on this. We're going to link to the report in the show notes if anyone's interested. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was that basically from, I don't know, 1970 to the current day, US auto production just stays at basically the same level almost forever, with one or two exceptions. It's like between 9 to 12 million cars are produced in the US every single year. And at the low end, it's 9 million. At the high end, it's 12 million. But that's been the case for like 50 years running, between 9 and 12 million cars every single year. So you hinted that the perception of decline is rooted not in the US overall, but in a specific region, in the specific kind of heartland Detroit automotive story. Can you tell us what's happening with Detroit specifically?
Yeah. So, you know, we hear a lot about how imports killed the U.S. auto industry, or even, people talk, well, the South is who killed the U.S. auto industry, and imports moving in there. But the decline of Detroit really began in the 40s and 50s. A lot of auto production was concentrated in the city of Detroit itself. And starting in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the big three began moving their investments outside of Detroit. They were dealing with a lot of militant labor. And again, this is the Treaty of Detroit that a lot of progressives hold in such high esteem. The Treaty of Detroit itself began to push Detroit out of or push the big three out of the city of Detroit. So you see this huge decline.
And for those who aren't necessarily familiar, what is the Treaty of Detroit?
The Treaty of Detroit was there was a period when the auto industry was very militant towards its workers, especially Henry Ford. And the Treaty of Detroit is like when the companies all became unionized. And so the UAW, one big union, representing all three companies. Now you have this sort of labor monopoly over U.S. auto production. and it was a reduction in there was a lot of militancy, and so a lot of combat between the workers and the and the companies, and that was the sort of resolution of all that. Now, that empowered the labor unions to do large strikes, to shut down plants. There were a ton of shutdowns, and that started to push the companies outside of Detroit. They wanted to look for places where, even though they were still unionized, they were dealing with less combatant labor unions, where the workers had less sort of command over the company, and sort of splitting up production. So you see them from the 50s to the 80s. The U.S. auto industry doesn't just move south; it moves to Ohio, moves to Pennsylvania, moves to California, moves to Indiana. So there's really a first migration out of Detroit and Michigan that precedes the rise of the South. And a lot of that, it has to do with the push of unions.
Just to add a statistic there, and again, I'm just cribbing from Adam's work. I don't think that I actually know any of this independent of anything here, but there's a great chart that shows like how did, on a state by state basis, automotive employment change from 1950 to 1980. And again, this is supposedly the time, like right when globalization might have been killing the auto industry, but I think it's 47 out of 50 states saw an increase in automotive employment. And the three states that didn't were like New York and Michigan, and then I guess randomly Massachusetts for some reason. But essentially every state was still growing except for Detroit. Detroit and Michigan, the car companies were fleeing them.
Yeah, and at least from 1950 to 1980, the largest gains were Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. So this really like sort of preceded the huge surge in manufacturing movement to the South. This was like a first exodus of Detroit. So
But then people do have this, kind of storyline, especially about Japan, that the U.S. auto industry was dominant, and there's this whole phenomenon, not just even in this industry, but like post World War II, America's like kind of the sole global economic superpower, and we're the only advanced industrial economy that did not get bombed into rubble. And so we have the unquestioned mightiest industries in just a whole range of industries, and automotive was certainly one of those. And so we coasted for a while, and car companies from the US were dominant globally. And then Japan came, and the Japanese basically kicked our asses over the course of, I'm not aware of the exact timeline, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. All of a sudden, what used to be a joke, they used to joke about how, oh, the Japanese can't build a car, they're unreliable, they make tiny little shoe boxes. And all of a sudden, they just woke up one day and realized the Japanese are actually killing us. Again, my question is kind of, how much of this is true? Is this true in parts? Is this true in its entirety? Is this not true at all? How do you and the actual facts on the ground see the experience of Japanese competition here?
the Japanese were undoubtedly disruptive to the U.S. auto industry and the global auto industry, really. I mean, we had our sort of protectionism against Japan, but Germany and other countries negotiated their own as well in the 1970s. So I think there was a rapid rise of Japan, and they did, starting in there were some exports in the 50s and the 60s, but it really started to pick up in the 70s when they began to export to the US in large numbers. And I think what's happening in Japan is half of the story. Japan had very innovative companies. You had companies that were not just, it wasn't just cost. Like there's sort of a myth that like the Japanese government just pours money on the workers, and the companies have very like tight stranglehold over their workers, labor repression, and through currency manipulation, Japan is keeping exports very cheap, and so because of cost, the Japanese are sort of dominant, but that's really, really not the whole story. The Japanese were innovating in production techniques. They invented lean, what's called lean production today, lean technology, and it's really a management style. And it was a huge disruption of the traditional mass assembly that the U.S. auto industry was using. And so they were making cars eventually that were more reliable, and also they were more innovative. This wasn't even something I was able to get to in the paper, but one of the interesting facts about the post-war Japanese auto industry is they weren't allowed to have an aerospace industry in Japan in the post-war period. And so you had all these aerospace engineers who had nothing to do, and they ended up in the auto industry. And you have a lot of a long-standing tradition of engineering education in Japan. So the auto companies had a lot of really great innovative engineers, and they were making breakthroughs over there. Honda's CVCC engine was one of the first was able to pass the new stricter EPA standards in the 1970s. So like real breakthroughs, and that's the Japan side. On the U.S. side, there's a whole other half to this, which was that the U.S. auto industry was just sclerotic. I mean, you had super high labor costs. The management relationships and labor relationships were to the point of absurdity. Like, people couldn't do their jobs, and factories were run terribly. They stopped innovating. There's a point in time when you read any automotive history of the 1960s and 70s, and people say, look, the big three haven't had a real innovation since the 1940s. All they kept doing was making bigger and bigger and bigger cars. They weren't making small cars. Energy prices were going up, and so because it was an oligopoly, because the labor was a monopoly, and those two halves worked together to really make the industry unproductive and uninnovative.
And that was kind of the intersection with like the economic crisis that we were in the late 70s and early 80s, right? When, like you said, there's an energy crisis, oil prices are through the roof, inflation is through the roof. America's kind of reeling a little bit, just the whole economy. And in that economy, these giant gas guzzling cars that American companies were making all of a sudden didn't look as appealing as the smaller, more economical, efficient Japanese cars. Is that kind of one of the factors here?
Exactly. And so it's very rich to be sort of blaming the Japanese when what you have is an industry that's not innovating, negotiating with labor that has become completely uncompetitive and unproductive. And in the context of a U.S. macroeconomy, that's just terrible because of policy mistakes. I mean, this is, the Nixon era. We've got super high inflation. We've got a Federal Reserve that's lost its independence, and so inflation is super high. You have the Volcker shock trying to undo this. Like, the U.S. economy is a mess. The U.S. auto industry is a mess, and none of that is the fault of the Japanese. And what a important time for U.S. consumers to have access to reliable, fuel efficient vehicles, right? Like, they were in many ways bailing us out and pushing our industry to become more competitive and adapt.
Let's talk about that adaptation and what the U.S. response was, because there's a lot of discussion, and I think this is going to tie into some very relevant modern topics about how should you respond to this sort of thing. Japan is all of a sudden, people are worried, oh my gosh, they're going to kick our butts in this industry. And as so often happens, the question of protectionism comes up. Should we just put into place tariffs or barriers or some sort of quota or something to protect our auto industry because it's really important? We have to save these jobs. It's the symbol of America. We're all going to collapse and die without it. What was the conversation like, and what ended up happening? And I'm curious about the mythology of this and how some of these decisions we made actually ended up impacting the auto industry.
Yeah. So this is what makes it, I think, very relevant, is that if you read an argument today from a protectionist uh, about arguing for more protectionist U.S. policy, you're going to hear like one of three historical anecdotes from them. They have the same three historical anecdotes. And one of them is this period of protectionism against Japanese cars, the voluntary export restraints. This was a voluntary agreement that Japan restricted their companies to a specific quota of exports to the US. This happens in 1981. And the story goes, the myth making is that, well, here we have this cute little policy. It's just a quota restraint. It's voluntary. It's not even a tariff. And then what happens is the Japanese automakers come to the US and start producing here. And that's how, that's why we have Japanese factories today.
Can I ask a question here? Because I know there's more to say on this, but like, is that a win or is that not? Because it seems like protectionism gets very confused in instances where, like, well, the US automakers might still be in decline, but at least Toyota is building their cars in Kentucky now instead of in, Hokkaido or whatever.
Well, there's two different questions, and this is really important. Is that a win for someone who thinks our goal should have been to make the Japanese produce here? That would be a more defensible position. Is that a win for the people who were making the argument at the time, the people who designed the policy? That's not the case. So you really had two sides that were arguing for this protectionism. One were the people, and these were people, some of them in the Reagan administration, who said, look, we need to give the big three breathing room. They're going to be fine in the long run. They just need breathing room. In contemporary reports, you hear this phrase over and over again: breathing room, breathing room. The big three needs breathing room. They're going to figure it out. And so in the case of breathing room, it really did not help them much. The demand collapsed so much that the quotas were barely binding. By the time the quotas really mattered, the industry had recovered and things were booming. So the breathing room didn't really happen. And when it comes to the other advocates for the unions who had been arguing for more than a decade that companies should come here, Japanese companies should come here and hire union workers and make them in this country, and that's obviously not what happened. They went to the South. They're non-unionized plants, so it did not give them breathing room. It did not lead to union jobs. You can argue, I disagree, but you can argue that it caused the FDI in the South. But again, it's hard to make the case that this was brilliant tactical industrial policy if it failed to achieve the goals of those who are fighting for it. Even if you sort of like the unintended consequences way that it played out, that's not much of an argument for tactical industrial policy.
And obviously we're not talking about the consumers here, whether or not this led to, better quality, lower prices and all of that. But it's very interesting to me, the whole idea of kind of moving production around globally, because this is something that you see in many industries, right? You see this in like the garment industry is famously one of the most mobile industries. It relocates every couple decades based on where the labor is cheapest. It was in Japan and Korea for a little while, and then it moved to China, and then it's in Bangladesh, and on and on and on. And it's interesting that the same thing can kind of happen in automotive, because it obviously cars as a product are so different from garments. They are far more complex. They have far more inputs. They require far more like subcontractors and much larger supply chains. They're very intricate machines, and you've got to deal with a bunch of the company that's making the transmission, and the company that's making the tires, and the company that's making this and that, and the whole thing. And yet you still see some of that mobility. You still see, American plants that are actually producing Hondas or BMWs or Toyotas. And recently, even, some of the air quotes American plants are actually moving to Mexico, but they can still remain part of that North American supply chain, so to speak. And was this always inevitable? Like, is this something that was just going to happen regardless of, policy and protectionism? Or is this something that really was caused by protectionism and might never have happened if not for it?
Yeah, I really believe that this was going to happen anyway, and this is really the crux of the argument. Advocates of voluntary export restraints like to say that they made it happen, and part of the argument there that they find so compelling is that this is sort of they see this as a nudge towards a different equilibrium. It's a temporary nudge, so you can just it's there's this desire to see market outcomes as being sort of like a choice. We can just if we just nudge production in this direction, then we can have a lot more manufacturing. Just temporary nudge. You have multiple equilibria, and all we have to do is do these little things. I don't think that that's a very good description of global auto production tendencies. I think, especially for a large market, what happens is automakers import to test the market. They import small volume vehicles. When vehicles become large in demand, when you have a really big, well-selling vehicle, you tend to try to domestically produce that. This minimizes exchange rate risk. It minimizes transportation costs. It helps you get closer to the customer. And the auto industry, even within the US, is just filled with examples of this. So like the oldest example I could find, and this is fun because this isn't even in the paper. But the oldest I found for the paper was Volvo in 1973. They bought a factory in Virginia for $100 million to start assembling cars. They were going to make 200,000 cars there. So this is 1973. This is 18 years before Japanese voluntary export restraints. And so here you have a company who just sees the economic logic of producing in the U.S. Now, they didn't end up making the vehicles there. It was sort of abandoned, but that was the plan.
It seems really obvious in one sense in that cars are physically very large products, and it's got to be extraordinarily expensive to ship them, across the ocean in order to, sell them. Maybe I'm overestimating the cost of shipping here, but like compared to, a t-shirt, which is tiny and small and easy to ship, like a car is very difficult to ship. And and especially, with as many heavy components and as delicate as it can be to get, you don't want it to get thrown around in a storm at sea or whatever. You'd think, yeah, you would just want it to be produced right next to where it's going to be sold.
Yes, that's true. It's not everything, obviously. So like shipping costs and currency exchange rates, those are real factors that push companies towards domestic production. Now, there's other factors as well, and that importantly includes economies of scale and assembly. So you don't want to build a factory in the U.S. to make 10,000 vehicles, right? You don't get the right economies of scale, and so automakers typically wait until they have some sort of scale of sales, and that's the point at which the benefits of local assembly outweigh the costs. So that's like the natural push. And I was going to mention, I found one even early example of this economics playing out from 1955. Volkswagen actually purchased a Studebaker plant in 1955 in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And so the first actual foreign assembly that happened in the US was 1978. It was Volkswagen, but way, way, way before that, 1955, they were coming close to doing it, going to the point of actually buying a factory. So you have this, and then of course, since then you have Korean automakers coming here as well. So none of these other companies are being affected by voluntary export restraints. They're not being pushed here by protectionism. They're doing it because there's an economic logic to it.
Now, by way of a final question, this obviously has implications for what's going on in the economy today. The Trump administration has made a point of trying to say that they are going to be the saviors of the U.S. auto industry. I believe Stephen Miller, everyone's God's favorite little goblin, said that the U.S. industry was at the point of we weren't going to have one unless Trump had taken strong action. So when it comes to the Trump administration's actions, which are tariffs on I believe on foreign automobiles plus tariffs on like inputs like steel and other things, plus just tariffs just on trading partners, just in general, just on everything. How is that going to impact the industry? Is that actually going to protect them? Is it going to help or hurt? What can we expect moving forward?
There's two kind of components to this to think about. One is the North American auto industry, and the other is China. The important thing is that like the North American free trade area, NAFTA, should be as frictionless as possible to allow the auto industry to be as competitive as possible. We've shown that when you have that sort of free movement, that countries specialize. Mexico specializes in some parts of production. We specialize in other parts of production. They do the lower value add. We do the higher value add. We do the R&D. And the end result is sort of what you call factory North America. And this is a competitive, globally competitive, okay? And that helps the U.S. auto industry to stay resilient and be globally competitive to last in the long run. I think what we're doing to throw sand in the gears between Canada, Mexico, and the United States is senseless. There is no policy rationale for trying to bring low-end auto assembly from Mexico to the US or any auto assembly. I mean, I don't see why, especially since the industry has not been decimated, especially since we're talking about a lot of greenfield factories in the South and places where the unemployment is already low and you're already seeing tons of investment. I don't see the case for pushing for marginally more of that at the expense of raising costs for the consumer and making the industry as a whole less competitive. That's easy. The answer there. Do nothing. Go back to USMCA. Make it as frictionless as possible. The harder industrial policy challenge we face is what to do about China. Their industry does seem to have moved ahead technologically. They are exporting a lot of cars to Europe. I don't believe there's any world in which all cars are made in China and they're exported. Again, because of the nature of the industry. But I think that there are national security questions, especially as autonomous driving becomes more standard, and cars are going to be watching you, listening to you, checking on what you're doing, and having a Chinese company in control of every car on the road in the U.S. If someone tells me there's a national security issue there, I'm all ears. I think that's an interesting challenge, especially given that China has made technological leaps forward, and we don't want to keep the U.S. consumer walled off from them. Cars are expensive, and having less expensive cars would help grow real wages in the U.S. So, what exactly we do about that is a more complex challenge. I think the best way to handle this is through multinational trade agreements, something like the TPP, to prevent where you say to China, look, if you want to trade with all these countries, here are the sort of best practices you have to engage. Stop with the intellectual property theft. Stop with the egregious subsidies of your automakers. And, that way Europe and the US and the rest of Asia can sort of hold hands and come to China with a set of conditions that they have to, embrace if they want to export their autos into those places. You could also incentivize China to engage in joint ventures with U.S. companies for security reasons. But none of this is about closing the door. It's about how do we benefit from their innovations and their productivity while dealing with whatever national security threat there may or may not be. But I granted it's a more challenging thing than what do you do with Mexico, which is you open the border for automobile trade.
Well, I want to say thank you one more time to my guest, Adam Ozimek. The report from the Economic Innovation Group is in the show notes. Everybody go take a look if you're interested. And Adam, thank you one more time for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.